Sam cautiously stepped deeper into the abandoned alien ship, the cold metal floor beneath his boots groaning with every movement. His heart raced, the echo of his footsteps the only sound in the stillness. The ship, despite its age and obvious damage, seemed strangely alive. The walls hummed softly, as if responding to his presence. Sam adjusted his helmet and ran a quick scan on his equipment. Everything seemed to be functioning properly, but something felt off. The air was thin, carrying an unsettling chill that made him shiver despite his suit. He continued forward, drawn to the faint light flickering in the distance. As he moved, the ship seemed to shift around him. The hulls twisted in odd angles, and the deeper he ventured, the more alien everything felt. There were no signs of life, no crew, no voices, not even the sounds of machinery. Just the strange hum of the energy systems, which pulsed more intensely the further he went. It felt like the ship itself was watching him, waiting. Eventually, Sam found himself standing before a massive door. It slid open with a loud hiss, revealing a dark, expansive room filled with strange, glowing tubes that lined the walls. Inside each tube was a figure, a creature, but it wasn't moving. It was frozen, suspended in a strange crystalline cocoon. Sam's breath caught in his throat. These weren't just any alien bodies. They were preserved, suspended in time. He stepped closer to one of the tubes. The creature inside was unlike anything he had seen before. Tall, slender, with elongated limbs and a smooth, featureless face. Its eyes were closed, but there was a faint glow in them, as though some life force still pulsed within. Sam leaned in closer, his hand resting on the cold glass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. These creatures were not dead, not entirely. It was as if they had been frozen, waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. Suddenly, a strange whisper echoed in Sam's ear, soft, distorted, and chilling. "You shouldn't be here." He jerked back, his pulse quickening. Was it the ship, or something else? He scanned the room again, but there was no sign of movement, no indication of life, just the flickering of the ship's dim lights. Sam shook his head, trying to clear his mind. He needed to stay focused. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to turn back now. But as he looked at the cocooned figures, a terrible thought began to form in his mind. What if they weren't just being preserved? What if this wasn't just some ancient ship? What if the creatures inside these cocoons were alive, but trapped in some sort of suspended animation? He swallowed hard. He couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play here. He began walking around the room, examining the other pods. There were dozens of them, some empty, others still holding their alien occupants. As his light swept over the tubes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A small, faintly glowing symbol was etched on the walls, not far from the pods. It looked familiar, something he had seen in his research about ancient alien civilizations. The symbol was connected to something terrible. A warning. The mark of an entity, something that could control life, death, and everything in between. Sam froze. He could feel the temperature drop around him, a cold wave creeping up his spine. His mind raced. What had happened here? Why were these creatures frozen? And why was the ship still alive, still pulsing with energy? What was the entity? What did it want? A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears, a crackling like the hum of electricity. He turned quickly. The walls seemed to shift again, bending in unnatural angles, and the strange humming grew louder, more intense. The glow from the tubes became brighter, and Sam could feel it. Something was changing. The ship was reacting to him. It was alive, and it knew he was there. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest, and that's when he noticed it. One of the tubes was shaking. A faint ripple of energy passed through the glass. The creature inside the pod stirred, its body twitching as though it were waking up. Sam's breath caught in his throat. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. He couldn't look away. The creature's eyes flickered open, glowing a soft, eerie blue. It blinked, and then it looked directly at him. In that moment, Sam felt something deep in his chest, a sense of utter dread, a weight that pressed down on him, suffocating him. The creature's gaze was intelligent, yet hollow. It seemed to recognize him, yet its expression was empty, as though it was not entirely alive, not entirely dead. The thing inside the pod wasn't just a preserved body. It was something else, something in between, caught between two states of existence. The creature's hand twitched again, and Sam stumbled backward, nearly falling. He turned quickly and ran toward the exit, but before he could reach the door, the ship groaned loudly, as though protesting his escape. The humming turned into a low, resonating growl, and the lights flickered wildly. Shadows shifted in the corners of his vision, and the walls seemed to pulse as though the ship itself were coming to life. Suddenly, the ship's main lights shut off completely, plunging Sam into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could find it, the whisper returned, louder this time. "You should not have come here." His mind raced. The creature in the pod had awoken. The ship was alive, and it was reacting to his presence. But why? What was happening to him? What was this place? Really? Sam's heart pounded in his ears, and he realized he was no longer alone. In the darkness, something moved, something watching. Sam's heart was pounding as the darkness swallowed him whole. He could hear nothing but the rush of his own breath and the distant hum of the ship's failing systems. The cold, metallic walls seemed to press in on him as he stumbled through the pitch-black corridor, his flashlight shaking in his hand. His mind raced with questions, but there was no time to answer them. The eerie silence was broken only by his footsteps, which echoed too loudly in the narrow hallways. The ship had changed. He could feel it. The energy inside the vessel had shifted, become alive. There was something in the air, a tension that pulled at his every nerve, as if the walls themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He felt like an intruder in a space that had long since grown used to its solitude. He wasn't supposed to be here, that much was clear. Suddenly, he heard something, a soft scrape of metal against metal, just ahead. Sam froze, his blood running cold. His first instinct was to run, to get back to the docking bay, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His eyes darted around, but there was no sign of anything. The sound had stopped, but the ship was not silent anymore. A flicker of light illuminated the hallway, and Sam's flashlight caught something moving in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, the light catching a figure standing motionless just ahead. It was tall, but humanoid, its silhouette blending with the darkness. He couldn't make out its features, but he knew that it wasn't human. Without warning, the figure shifted, its form rippling in a way that defied logic, as if it were made of liquid metal. Sam's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the creature. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, fluid, unsettling, and yet familiar in some way. The air around it shimmered, as if the ship itself was warping in response to its presence. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice echoed in his mind, distant and distorted, like a long-forgotten memory trying to claw its way to the surface. The words didn't come from the figure's mouth, but from the air itself. Sam's skin crawled as a cold, unnatural chill ran down his spine. He knew he was in danger. This wasn't just a ship. It wasn't just a vessel of alien design. It was something far darker, something ancient. He swallowed hard and turned on his heel, his instincts screaming at him to get out. He ran, the sound of his feet pounding against the metal floor, but it felt like the ship was closing in on him. No matter how fast he moved, it seemed like the corridors stretched out endlessly. The walls curved in unnatural angles, and the ship twisted, turning him around in impossible loops. His breath came in shallow gasps as the feeling of being hunted grew stronger with every step. Suddenly, The hallway he was running through collapsed into darkness, and the lights flickered again, this time with an angry buzz. The ship seemed to be alive, feeding off his fear, reacting to his every movement. He turned another corner, hoping for an exit, but instead he found himself in a massive chamber. The air was thick, and the walls were lined with strange, alien symbols, symbols that seemed to shift and change before his eyes, their meanings just out of reach. In the center of the room, he spotted a massive circular platform, its surface glowing with an eerie green light. It was surrounded by rows of alien capsules, just like the ones he had seen earlier. But this time, the capsules were open, and the figures inside were no longer frozen. The alien bodies were awake, their limbs twitching, their eyes glowing faintly as they slowly came to life. Sam's breath caught in his throat. This was no ordinary ship. It was a breeding ground, a place where these creatures had been incubating, evolving, changing into something otherworldly, something far more dangerous. Without warning, the platform in the center of the room hummed to life, and the air seemed to thicken. The alien figures started to move, their limbs stiff at first, then more fluid as they began to rise from their pods. The glowing eyes of the creatures locked onto Sam, and in that instant, he realized just how outnumbered he was. The walls shook again, this time with greater intensity. The ship groaned, as though something deep within it was awakening. Sam's heart hammered in his chest, the thumping sound deafening in his ears. The creatures, these inhuman beings, began to move toward him. Their faces were featureless, yet their eyes held an intelligence that sent a jolt of fear through his body. They were aware of him. They were watching him, and they were coming for him. Sam turned and ran, his footsteps frantic, his mind racing for an escape. But the hallways of the ship were no longer familiar. They seemed to twist and change, and the walls were alive with the same pulsating energy he had felt earlier. He could feel the entity, whatever it was, closing in on him, feeding off his terror. The ship was shifting around him, changing its shape to trap him. There was no escape. The entity, the intelligence that controlled the ship, was no longer dormant. It was awake, and it was hunting him. In a panic, Sam grabbed the nearest control panel, hoping to find a way to shut the ship down, to stop whatever was happening. His fingers scrambled over the buttons, his breath ragged as he tried to access any system that might help. The screen flickered, then came to life, but instead of the normal interface, it displayed only one message, a symbol that was burned into his mind, one he had seen before. The same symbol was now flashing on the screen in bright red. "You have awakened it." Before Sam could react, the walls shook violently, and a loud, unnatural screech echoed through the ship. Something was coming for him. Something bigger, something more powerful. The ship was alive, and it was angry. Suddenly, the doors slammed shut, trapping him inside. The creatures were closing in, their eyes glowing brighter as they moved faster. Sam turned to face the now activated entity, which had emerged from the dark recesses of the ship. He was face to face with it now, and it was more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a ship, it was a creature, and Sam was about to become part of its nightmare. Sam's mind raced as he stood in the middle of the dark chamber, surrounded by the growing presence of the alien creatures. The air was thick with tension, and the walls felt like they were closing in. He could hear the soft, eerie hum of the ship's systems, louder now, almost as if it were alive, breathing in sync with the growing pulse in his own chest. His fingers trembled on the control panel, but the screen in front of him flashed erratically, showing nothing but the red symbol over and over again. "You have awakened it." There was no time to think. His heart pounded in his ears as the alien figures slowly circled around him. Their eyes glowed brighter with every passing second, and the cold, hollow stare they gave him sent shivers through his body. They were aware of him, and they were waiting for the signal to strike. But it wasn't just the creatures that terrified Sam. It was the feeling that the ship itself was watching, waiting for something. Sam felt a strange pressure building in his chest, as if the very air around him was tightening. The walls vibrated slightly, the hum of the ship now reverberating deep within his bones. He wasn't just on a ship. He was inside a living organism. The entity. The thing that had somehow merged with this alien vessel. Sam didn't know how or why, but he felt it now. The ship was no longer just a machine. It was alive, a consciousness that fed off the energy of everything around it, and it was feeding on his fear. He turned quickly, hoping to escape, but the doors to the chamber slammed shut with a deafening thud. The alien creatures hissed as they moved in closer, their long, thin limbs twitching unnaturally. Sam's pulse quickened. The creatures were changing, their bodies warping and shifting in ways that should have been impossible. Their limbs grew longer, their skin shimmering like liquid metal. They were no longer just alien bodies in suspended animation. They were alive, and they were becoming something much more terrifying. The ship trembled, and the hum grew louder, more insistent. Sam staggered backward as the platform in the center of the room began to glow brighter. The ship was reacting to his presence, and whatever had awakened within the creatures was now shifting, taking form. Sam's instincts screamed at him to run, but the ship wasn't giving him an escape. The entity was controlling everything now. Its power surged through the ship's energy core, feeding on Sam's every move. He spotted a narrow opening near the back of the room, an emergency escape hatch. It was his only chance. But before he could move, the creature closest to him lunged forward, its body twisting into a blurry mass of shadow and light. It was fast, too fast. Sam barely had time to react before it was upon him. The creature's arm reached out, its fingers elongating like claws, and he barely dodged, falling to the ground. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal, and he felt an intense heat as the creature's hand scraped past him, leaving a trail of electrical sparks in the air. Sam scrambled to his feet, heart racing. The creature hissed at him, its face featureless yet somehow full of intelligence, its eyes glowing with a strange, unnatural light. It spoke, but not with its voice. The words came into Sam's mind, cold, commanding. "You are not meant to escape." A surge of power coursed through the ship as the voice echoed through Sam's thoughts. He felt a strange pull, an overwhelming presence pushing him to the floor, as if the ship itself was trying to crush him. The alien creatures moved faster, their bodies becoming more fluid, as if they were no longer bound by the same laws of physics Sam knew. They were shifting, bending, changing. The room felt like it was shifting with them, the walls twisting, contorting, as though the entity was reshaping everything around them. The pressure in the room grew unbearable, and Sam gasped for air. His head spun as the weight of the ship's presence seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. He reached for his blaster, but his hands were shaking too much. He wasn't sure if the weapon would even work against something like this, something that was no longer just a ship, but a living entity, a consciousness that controlled everything within it. But then, in the chaos, something caught his eye. The energy core. It was the heart of the ship, the source of its power, pulsing with a sickly green light. If he could just reach it, maybe he could shut the ship down. Maybe he could destroy whatever was controlling it. Sam's survival instinct kicked in. He wasn't about to let this entity win. With the creatures closing in, Sam bolted for the center of the room, his mind focusing on the energy core. The creatures hissed as he passed, but they couldn't keep up. They were too slow now, too focused on the entity's will to stop him. Sam reached the core, his hands flying over the console. The ship shook violently as the energy surged around him, sending sparks flying. His eyes widened in horror as the screen flickered to life, showing a cryptic message. "You cannot destroy us." It was then that Sam realized something horrible. The entity didn't need the ship anymore. It had become the ship. It had merged with it, controlled it for eons. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was the prison, the containment. The entity was trapped, but not anymore. It was feeding on his energy, on the ship's systems, growing stronger with each passing second. The entire room seemed to shift around him, the walls bending inward. A loud mechanical screech echoed through the chamber as the ship's systems began to overload. The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes fixed on Sam. The entity was no longer just controlling the ship, it was using the creatures, converting them. And now it wanted him. Suddenly, the lights flickered one last time, the entire chamber vibrating with energy. Sam had only one choice. He had to get to the escape pod, or he would never make it out alive. He turned to run, but before he could take another step, a loud voice, the entity's voice, thundered in his mind. "You cannot leave. You belong to us now." And then, everything went dark. The darkness was absolute. Sam's entire body felt heavy, like he was sinking into the very floor beneath him. His heart was a drumbeat in his chest, the only thing that kept him grounded in the suffocating silence that had overtaken the room. His vision swam in and out of focus, his mind still racing from the horrors he had just witnessed. His breath came in short, frantic bursts, but his limbs were too sluggish, too weighed down by the crushing force that seemed to have engulfed him. Then, without warning, the darkness receded. Light, blinding and intense, pierced through the fog of his mind. The ship groaned, its massive engines pulsing as if awakening from a deep slumber. Sam's eyes snapped open, but everything around him was a blur of motion. His body felt like it was floating, disjointed and out of sync with the reality around him. For a split second, he didn't know where he was. Was he still on the alien vessel? Had he somehow been pulled into another dimension? The walls seemed to ripple, their shapes twisting and changing, moving in ways that defied any logic Sam had ever known. He tried to stand, but his legs were unsteady, and his balance betrayed him. He staggered forward, gripping the nearest console for support, his head spinning. The humming of the ship's systems was deafening now, filling his mind with the sickening realization that the entity had won. It wasn't just controlling the ship anymore, it was becoming one with it. He could feel the very air vibrating, pulsing in time with the entity's power, as though the ship was alive and conscious. Then, a voice. It wasn't the cold, mechanical voice that had echoed in his mind earlier. This was something different, something more intimate. It was inside his head, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a vice. "You can't escape, Sam." The voice was low, melodic, but carried an unmistakable malice. "You never could." Sam's breath caught in his throat as he looked around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent, except for the hum of the ship's systems. The walls twisted once again, distorting his sense of reality. He was trapped. The entity had taken control of the ship, but more than that, it had taken control of him. He clenched his fists, trying to ignore the panic rising in his chest. This was it, the final confrontation. He had to do something, anything. He couldn't just give in to the entity's voice. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let it win. He pushed himself off the console, staggering toward the escape pod that he had spotted earlier, but it was too far, too out of reach. The ship seemed to shift around him again, walls closing in as though the very vessel was aware of his presence, aware of his attempts to escape. He could feel it, the entity's power surging through the ship, tightening its grip on him. It wanted him to stay. It wanted to consume him. As Sam stumbled forward, his mind raced. He had to fight back. He had no other choice. A flicker of hope sparked within him. The energy core. If he could reach it, if he could somehow destroy it, he could take the entity down with it. He had seen the power it held over the ship. If he could sever the connection, if he could shut down the core, maybe, just maybe, he could escape. The creatures, the entity, they would all be powerless without it. His steps quickened, despite the overwhelming force that seemed to press against him. The walls shifted again, but this time, Sam didn't stop. He pushed through the disorienting distortion, fighting the pull that threatened to drag him back into the ship's grasp. Every part of him screamed for him to turn back, to give up, but he ignored it. The core was ahead, a faint glow at the end of the hallway, like a beacon. He was so close. But then, the voice came again, louder this time, almost like a physical presence in his mind. "You are mine now, Sam," he gasped, the words echoing through his mind, threatening to crush him. It was as if the ship itself were pulling at him, dragging him deeper into the void. But Sam's determination burned brighter than the entity's influence. He was not its puppet. He had a purpose, a mission, and he was going to finish it. Sam sprinted toward the energy core. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he pushed through it. His vision blurred again, but he didn't slow down. He had to reach it. He had to destroy it. As he reached the core, the walls around him trembled, a deep guttural growl rising from within the ship. The entity was aware of him, and it was angry. But Sam wasn't afraid anymore. His hands fumbled over the control panel, searching for the shutdown mechanism, but before he could find it, the creatures appeared, emerging from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on him. They moved fast, impossibly fast, and one of them lunged for him, its claws reaching for his throat. Sam ducked, barely avoiding the attack, but the creature's hand grazed his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain through his body. He stumbled back, but his eyes locked onto the energy core. He knew what he had to do. With a desperate breath, he reached for the emergency override switch. He slammed his hand onto the panel, and the ship shuddered violently, the lights flickering in and out. The creatures screeched in pain as the energy fluctuated, and the walls of the ship began to crack, fractures appearing like wounds on the surface of a dying organism. The entity screamed inside Sam's mind, its voice full of rage and desperation. "No, you can't. You will not destroy me." But it was too late. The core began to shut down, and as it did, the energy in the ship began to dissipate. The creatures faltered, their forms flickering and destabilizing. The walls around Sam groaned, shifting in unnatural ways as the ship's systems began to fail. He could feel the entity's grip weakening, its power fading as the core lost its connection. But even as the entity faltered, Sam knew he wasn't safe yet. The ship was collapsing. He had triggered a chain reaction, and now everything was falling apart. He turned and ran, the creatures still hot on his heels, their forms flickering in and out of existence. The ship shook violently as the explosion that had been set in motion began to build. Sam's heart pounded as he sprinted toward the escape pod. He could hear the ship groaning, its walls cracking, the sound of destruction surrounding him. He reached the pod, his hand shaking as he slammed his fist on the launch button. The doors closed, and with a violent jolt, the pod shot out into the void of space. The last thing Sam saw as he glanced back at the dying ship was the creature's glowing eyes staring at him from the shadows. And then everything went black.